Everyone thinks accountants invented auditing because they're meticulous. They're wrong. They invented it because someone got away with the biggest inventory hoax in American history. In 1938, McKesson Robbins was a household name. The company controlled roughly 1/4 of all pharmaceutical distribution in the United States. Pharmacists relied on them, hospitals depended on them, investors trusted them completely. By every measure visible to Wall Street, McKesson Robbins was a fortress, profitable, growing, and absolutely impenetrable. Then in December of that year, everything collapsed. The man at the center of this was named Donald Miller. He'd been hired as a vice president of McKesson Robbins in the late 1920s. Miller had impeccable credentials, or so they seemed. No one at the company, not even the board of directors, knew his real name wasn't Donald Miller at all. It was Philip Musica, and Musica had a history. Musica had served time in prison in the early 1900s for forgery. He'd run confidence schemes. He disappeared into obscurity, reinvented himself, and somehow landed at one of America's largest pharmaceutical companies. He wasn't just a vice president, he controlled the entire crude drug division. That meant he had authority over inventory. That meant he had access to the numbers nobody else questioned. For years, Musica and his accomplices, including his own brothers, created phantom inventory. They didn't steal drugs, they didn't move anything physical, instead they fabricated records. They listed assets that didn't exist, they invented suppliers in Canada and Europe, they created fake invoices. On paper, McKesson Robbins held tens of millions of dollars in crude drug stock. In reality, most of it was air. The scheme ran for 7 years without detection. 7 years, auditors came and went. They examined the books, they found nothing wrong, they signed off on the accounts. The financial statements were certified as accurate. What the auditors didn't know, and here's what haunted the profession for decades, was that nobody had actually verified that the inventory existed. They'd looked at the paperwork, they'd never looked at the warehouses. December 1938, a routine bank loan request triggered the first real questions. A creditor demanded proof that the inventory actually existed. For the first time, someone insisted on physical verification. The walls came down, auditors went to the warehouses. What they found was catastrophic. The crude drug division was almost entirely empty. Approximately $87 million in assets, roughly $1.8 billion in today's money, simply didn't exist. Musica had been making decisions under pressure the entire time. He knew the scheme couldn't last forever. He knew discovery was inevitable. But he also knew that as long as the paperwork looked clean, the system wouldn't catch him. He was right about that. He was wrong about everything else. When the fraud surfaced, the stock price collapsed. Investors lost fortunes. The company's reputation was obliterated. Musica didn't wait for trial. On the day he was supposed to be arrested, he shot himself. The scandal was complete. The man who'd engineered one of the largest financial frauds in American history was gone. But the damage rippled far beyond one company or one man. The auditing profession faced a reckoning. Before McKesson Robbins, auditors operated under a simple assumption. If the paperwork was in order, the company was in order. Their job was to verify the records existed and the math was correct. It never occurred to them that the records themselves could be elaborate fiction. They weren't detectives, they were accountants. That distinction mattered enormously, and it had just cost the investing public nearly $2 billion. The Securities and Exchange Commission launched an investigation. Congress demanded answers. The auditing profession realized something fundamental had to change. You couldn't trust paperwork alone. You had to verify physical reality. You had to count the inventory. You had to reconcile what the books said with what actually existed. This wasn't just a procedural shift. It was a philosophical one. Auditing transformed from a clerical exercise into something closer to forensic investigation. Auditors became responsible for what they didn't know, not just what they could see. They had to ask harder questions. They had to think like skeptics, not rubber stampers. The auditing standards that emerged from McKesson Robbins became the foundation of modern financial oversight. Physical inventory verification became mandatory. Surprise audits became standard practice. The confirmation of receivables and payables directly with third parties became required. These weren't suggestions. They were rules written in blood, investor blood. What's striking looking back is how close the system came to catching this earlier. The fraud wasn't hidden in complexity. It was hidden in assumption. Everyone assumed someone else had verified the inventory. The auditors assumed management was honest. Management assumed the board was watching. The board assumed the auditors had done their job. Each party deferred to the other. That's how Musica operated for 7 years. Lesson didn't end in 1938. It echoed forward through decades. When Enron collapsed in 2001, auditors had missed billions in fabricated assets. When WorldCom imploded, the same pattern emerged: phantom revenue, unverified accounts, trust in paperwork instead of reality. Each time, companies thought they'd learned from the last scandal. Each time, new fraudsters found new ways to exploit the same human tendency to believe what's written. What McKesson Robbins actually proved was something simpler and more unsettling. You can't audit your way to honesty. You can only raise the cost of dishonesty. Musica made his decision knowing the rules. He calculated that the payoff was worth the risk. He was wrong about the detection timeline, but he was right that a clever fraudster could stay ahead of a system that didn't actively verify reality. The irony is brutal. The auditing profession was born from a lie. Modern financial oversight exists because someone figured out how to fool the old system completely. We have the auditing standards we do because Philip Musica proved that paperwork alone is worthless. Billions of dollars in regulations, training, and infrastructure exist because one man in the 1930s decided the numbers were easier to fake than the drugs were to move. Today, auditing is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's global, it's highly regulated, it employs hundreds of thousands of people. None of that exists without McKesson and Robbins. None of that exists without Musica's decision to forge the numbers instead of stealing the drugs. He invented the problem and the profession invented the response. That's how systemic change actually happens, through catastrophe, not consensus. The cost was real, investors lost everything. A company that had seemed unshakable was destroyed. A man took his own life rather than face the consequences, and yet from that wreckage came a system that has protected trillions in capital since. That's the brutal calculus of financial history. Sometimes catastrophe is the only teacher expensive enough to be remembered. Subscribe for the next corporate collapse, where the fraud was even more ingenious than the one before.